Afternoon. It's wonderful to see you here. I see people are still entering from the waiting room. I'm going to get started with introductions so that we can move on to this incredibly exciting series of talks and conversations this afternoon. My name is Bethany Wiggin, and I am the director of the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities at the University of Pennsylvania. It's my sincere pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to Solar Panel, Community, Fantasy, and Technology in Energy Futures. This is the second of a two-part program, the second of a three-part program, and I hope that you had a chance to join us for the first with Christina Hemauer and Roman Keller. If you did not, you can certainly still view their films, which are on the beautiful website created by PPEH's own Angela Ferranda. Christina and Roman have generously made the two films we talked about available on the website until March 4th. Today, you will hear more fulsome introductions to the illustrious panelists we have for you this afternoon. These are presented by PPEH artists in residence, Kristen, Neville, Taylor, and Ricky Yanas. In just a moment, this year's topic director, Daniel Barber, will introduce Kristen and Ricky to you. There's this whole gauntlet of introductions we're going through today. But before we turn it over to Daniel, let me just introduce him. So, as some of you heard me say in the first of this beautiful trilogy we're hosting for you, amidst these difficult circumstances besetting us, Daniel has curated a luminous constellation for this whole year on transitions and transformations, a constellation of artists, scholars, activists, thinkers, and doers exploring the line and the blur between transitions and transformations. He's offered us a kind of North Star, a beacon for the collaborative communities, the cross-sector partnerships, and the generous thinking that we need in the time of climate crisis. Daniel Barber is Associate Professor and Chair of the Graduate Group in Architecture at the Weitzman School of Design here at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of A House in the Sun, Modern Architecture and Solar Energy in the Cold War, which appeared with Oxford University Press in 2016. He more recently is the author of Modern Architecture and Climate, Design Before Air Conditioning, which appeared just last year with Princeton University Press. And he's co-editor of a series of dossiers on the subject of accumulation for the eFlux architecture platform. He has held many fellowships. He's been a visiting professor in Environment and Humanities at Princeton University. And as his many publications and projects demonstrate, not least of which is his programming this year with us at PPEH, Daniel is an indefatigable collaborator, and I'm really delighted to be working with him this year as we explore transformations and transitions. Please join me in giving Daniel a very warm welcome as our topic director. He will now introduce his visions and goals, and then introduce Kristen and Ricky to you. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Bethany. Thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. It's so great to see so many names and faces, and students and colleagues and others from Penn and around the community, and of course around the world, including our exciting guests that I am really excited to hear from. So it's really, I'll also just thank Bethany for the opportunity to put this programming together. It's really been a great chance to talk through a set of ideas that have been preoccupying my own research and my own life for many decades, in terms of really, thinking about how we move from reconsidering the terms and contexts in which we live relative to the carbon economy and the potential for a different sort of climate future, really shifting our discourse from that of a subtle and slow transition to perhaps a more dramatic but no less satisfying transformation, right? So that's really what we've been focusing on in the programming that we've put together for this year. We've developed this fabulous set of afternoons and evenings on the Solar Imaginary in collaboration with our artists in residence that I'll introduce in just a moment. And we'll be back in a little less, well, I guess about 3 weeks, March 17th, to have another fabulous discussion with the Settler Colonial City Project. So please keep your eyes out for the details on that as well. I'm going to just keep things rolling. Again, we have a few rounds of introductions, and we don't want to hold everybody up before getting to the fabulous conversation. So I'll briefly introduce our two artists in residence. Kristen Neville Taylor is an artist working in drawing, sculpture, glass, and installation. Her process has been described as alchemical and utilizes pseudoscientific experimentation to reimagine our relationship to natural futures. Taylor's work has been shown, among other venues, at Vox Populi, the Woodmere Art Museum, and the Philadelphia Art Alliance, Pacific Northwest College of Art in Portland, Richard Stockton and Rowan University Art Galleries in New Jersey, and Expo Chicago. She's very active as an organizer and curator, as we're already kind of seeing in evidence here today, in part through some of the moments there include the Landscape Techne exhibit at Little Berlin. Little Berlin is a gallery space that she co-founded, a collective that she's part of. Since 2007, Taylor has taught courses in glass and material studies at the University of the Arts, Tyler School of Art and Architecture, and the Moore College of Art Graduate Studies program. Ricky Yanas is a Texas-born artist, educator, and curator, working within a pragmatic tradition of problem finding. Ricky aims to create intersectional spaces of inquiry and mutual engagement through art making and art thinking. Recent projects include Extension or Communication Puerto Rico at Tiger Strike's Asteroid Gallery, one of our sort of gems of the Philadelphia art scene, and in collaboration with Taller Puerto Riqueño, and also The Green Sun, a collaboration with Kristen that laid the foundation in many ways and for our event last week and for this set of events that we're putting together here. Before I turn it over to them, I'll just ask you also to keep on your radar the third episode in this three-part event on solar imaginaries that will happen at the same time, same bat channel next week. 4 o'clock, we're calling it Solar Synthesis, sorry, it's a bit of a tricky one, in which we've invited a number of artists, students, community members, others from around the world to submit proposals to kind of think through the possible solar future, and they'll present those proposals briefly, and we'll have what I think will be really exciting discussion. So please keep your eye on that and join us also next week. And having said that, I'll turn it over to Ricky and Kristen. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. So we're so grateful to be here with everyone today to talk about pragmatic and speculative strategies for the future of energy. Thank you again, Bethany and Daniel, and especially Angela for being our organizing angel, crafting the invisible architecture that makes these programs possible. Seriously, you're a gem. In 2019, we had the privilege and pleasure of sharing space with some of our panelists at the Green Sun Micro Symposium, and today we welcome some new voices to the conversation. It's a big group and a big topic for the time frame, so we'll give abbreviated introductions, and forgive us, please. If you want to learn more about our guests, panelists, please visit the PPEH website, where you can learn a lot more about these amazing people. So today we'll be joined by Nora Elmarzuki. Nora is currently working as a climate justice organizer with Power in Philadelphia, working on statewide policies, coalitions, and base building. Nora co-founded the Friends, Peace, and Sanctuary Journal, the first Arabic newspaper in Philadelphia in 100 years. She is part of Insight Collaborative, a collective of 7 other women who, through their various work, seek to address issues of unequal urban development. We're welcoming Anthony Giancarino, who's a father of 3 daughters and brings over a decade of experience partnering with community leaders and organizations to develop policy strategies, participatory policy-making processes, and facilitate community-driven solutions that seek to dismantle structural racism within our energy, climate, and economic systems. He's worked at the local and national level, most recently through the Just Community Energy Transition Project here in Philadelphia. I imagine that's who you were talking to. You were talking to a funder earlier, Anthony, so I imagine you were working on that project specifically. Also, we have today Christina Hemauer and Roman Keller, who joined us last week for a screening of their films on solar histories, followed by a Q&A. We're welcoming them back Together, they explore the relationship between nature and culture in the age of climate change. One of their areas of interest is the history of oil and its competing alternatives. The artist duo heralded the era of post-petrolism for the arts with a manifesto in the year 2006. In collaboration with climate scientists for concerning the blueness of the sky in 2015, they learned that we're already living under an anthropogenic firmament. The color of the sky is not observed scientifically as it is not considered to be of relevant value. The artist duo believes that this is where art comes into play. Also, Rhys Williams, who joins us today from Scotland. Rhys is a lecturer of energy and environmental humanities at the University of Glasgow. His recent publications include Turning Towards the Sun, The Solarity and Singularity of New Food in the South Atlantic Quarterly, 2021, and The Shining Confluence of Magic and Technology, Solarpunk, Energy Imaginaries, and the Infrastructure of Solarity in Open Library of Humanities in 2018. And last but not least, we welcome Micah Gold-Markell, co-founder and co-owner of Solar States, a Philadelphia-based certified B company providing solar services and solar power education to the greater Philadelphia area. And after that big mouthful, I pass it on to Kristen, who will be transitioning us into our program.
Hi, everyone. So today is not meant to be a glorification of solar power, but we see it as an opportunity to talk about its limits and possibilities, and to rethink energy in our lives with people who've made that part of their life's work in very different ways. We see the solar panel today as a chance to build on ideas that were shared during the Green Sun Symposium, and to introduce hopefully some new inquiries into solar power. The Green Sun, again, was an exhibition and micro-symposium that looked at solar power for its narrative and technical potential. Bethany Wiggin generously moderated our first talk, where panelists examined and critiqued topics such as the Green New Deal, shared strategies for community solar, and reflected on the future of energy in Philadelphia in the wake of the South Philadelphia refinery explosion. Today, we have organized our thoughts loosely into the categories of community, technology, and fantasy. These categories are designed to guide us, not limit us, so we'll try as much as possible to embrace and to move into uncharted territory. So your participation is welcome and encouraged. Please use the chat. We'll field questions and observations periodically, and hopefully have some space at the end for audience questions. One of our main objectives today is to see where our unique contributions as artists, activists, business owners, and cultural producers align towards manifesting alternative energy futures. So to start, I wanted to pose a question to Nora and Anthony. So for the Green Sun Symposium in 2019, together you conducted a participatory workshop that demonstrated where our energy comes from and who controls our energy systems here in Philadelphia. To put it simply, we learned it was a vast tangled network of powerful people. The exercise also exposed why it's difficult to access renewable energy, especially if you're not a homeowner. Something that could change this is community solar energy policy. We know that in Pennsylvania, there are currently floating bills, HB 531 and Senate Bill 705. So that could make community solar a greater possibility. I was hoping that maybe you could describe community solar with those that might be less familiar, and tell us about the energy programs you've developed and advocated for here in Philadelphia. And what would it mean for these bills to be passed?
Anthony, do you want to start with some introduction to community solar? And then I have some thoughts on the community solar bill as of what I know so far. So maybe you can start.
Okay, sure. I was going to ask if you wanted to start. This is Nora and I we feed off each other. So yeah, so community solar, oh, sorry, I'm with my 4-year-old. So community solar is at the pure basic level, the idea of having multiple people be able to own one energy, like kind of solar system. So imagine if you are living in a row home in Philly, for example, and you don't have access to your roof, or you can't afford necessarily solar on by yourself. You and your neighbor and your neighbor and your neighbor could all kind of share collective ownership of one panel on one of the roofs, and all benefit from the solar that's generated, and all get credit on your bill for creating that solar. So it allows multiple people to kind of aggregate resources, aggregate their ability to leverage capital, to be able to kind of collectively own the solar project. Unfortunately, we cannot do that in Pennsylvania. We don't have enabling legislation for us. And so really it does create limits for folks who don't own homes. So if you're a renter, it's really hard to participate in the solar economy because you don't have ownership of your roof. Or if you live in a home that has lots of trees around it and you're not wanting to cut the trees down to create openness to get the sun in, it's hard for you to be able to participate in the solar economy. So community solar would vastly change the ability of people's, it would vastly change people's ability to actually participate in the solar economy. So that's at the pure basic level of what community solar would be for folks.
And Nora, you said you could maybe touch on that bill.
Yeah, so I'm slowly going through the most recent bill, which is another iteration of previous bills around community solar. And so far what's really standing out is there's a lot of hefty language, but there's so far no real equity features in this bill. And it's confusing to me how it's actually a community solar bill by the way that the language is about. It talks nothing about net metering, which is a part of community solar. The way that it breaks down how community solar works seems different from what I've actually learned about. So I'm not finished going through it, and I'm going through it with Pennsylvania Utility Law Project. But that's what I've got so far. It's not a great, the last couple of bills were not supported by some equity groups, and this one is better, but it still needs a lot of work to make it something that's equitable and that can address community issues.
Could you name like some specific equity features or community issues?
Yeah, there's, it seems to still put corporations on a hierarchy, and there doesn't seem to be any limitations on how community solar can be owned or built. There's talk of like residents, subscribers gaining credits, but it's not clear really how community is protected from increased charges, you know, things like that. So that's just the first thing that comes to mind. You had another question, but I don't remember what it was.
Oh, I think that's a good segue, though, into asking maybe Micah. I wanted to, you know, as the owner of Solar States, a solar energy company here in Philadelphia, I imagine you're accustomed to anticipating and adapting to changing legislation. And I was wondering how community solar policy figures into a for-profit business model.
Sure. I think it's important to clarify a little bit about community solar, because community solar is sort of a big term that encompasses several styles. What Anthony mentioned was one style where somebody can actually buy, say, 15 panels in a 2,000 panel solar array, and they will then have the output from those 15 panels sort of, you know, apportioned to their bill, no matter where they live. It's a pretty cool concept, I think. I mean, it's actually amazing. The other thing you can do is just say, I agree to buy my energy from community solar. And so you're buying sort of a fractional piece of the energy output of the solar array every year. And then you're what's called a subscriber to that solar array. How it affects business, I mean, my gosh, it's just incredible what I've seen in states. We actually have an application in New Jersey to do a community solar array at Taylor's Farm. No relation to Kristen, though. it's really cool because it allows you to have, you know, we can do things where like we're segmenting a part of the energy for low to middle income communities where we're going to guarantee 30% savings off of their electric bill. Like that's totally awesome, right? Why can we do that? Well, we can do that as a for-profit company because we're building the array on such a massive scale that the per watt cost of it is very low. And so we don't have to sort of squeeze the lemon for every ounce of juice. We can do things, you know, obviously you have to have this in your ethos as a company, but we can do things where we can say, well, you know, if we don't need to get every little dollar out of this, let's think about how we can maximize the benefit for the communities that are around this. And one of the ways we saw that was by offering big discounts to low to middle income folks. It also unlocks a lot of rural lands, farmlands, and it helps farmers. You know, not every inch of farmland is great for farming. Oftentimes there's places that for various reasons just aren't great for farming. And here farmers can get lease payments and utilize their land in ways that they hadn't. Instead of farming crops, now they're farming the sun, you know? And that creates a real win for everyone so that farmers can keep their land and continue farming. And by the way, you can have sheep grazing under solar panels. You can have all sorts of activities happening while you have solar on the site. And so it creates a real win for farmers, but it also creates a win for solar installers because, you know, to me, seeing the biggest impact of solar has been the jobs, and anything that allows for more solar to be installed is more jobs. And that's, you know, life-sustaining wages, healthcare, retirement plans for more people. And that's really what's going to win the day. You know, I was just on a little conference where we were talking with various legislators, excuse me, in the PA legislature about community solar and its importance. And there was also a bunch of gas folks and coal folks, and they were talking about all the jobs that are in those fields as well. And it's absolutely true. And you know, I didn't make this point, but I felt like saying, you know, there were a lot of jobs in the typewriter industry for a very long time, you know, and look, you know, those jobs were great jobs too. But if somebody was going to get trained, you know, in the late, you know, 1990s, you weren't getting trained on how to, you know, work a typewriter. You were getting trained on how to use a computer. And that's sort of how we see this transition. There are going to be more and more jobs there. And yes, there are existing jobs in other industries, but the more we can unlock solar, the better.
Thank you. So I wanted to maybe turn it over to Reese. I wanted to share a quote from your LA review of books, Solar Punk Against a Shitty Future. You said, quote, "It is possible that a shift to renewables will spell the end of capitalism, but alternative forms of energy are not compatible with capital's grail of profit and growth. But where there is a capitalist will, there is a capitalist way." So since the inception of the niche science fiction genre solar punk, you've written about it, its limits, its possibilities. And a couple of its, I'm a new student to solar punk, but a couple of its foundational characteristics are positivity and community. And I was wondering if you could briefly define solar punk to others that might be new to it and talk about how current systems are in conflict with its fundamental message.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so solarpunk is interesting. It's a kind of a subgenre, I suppose, of science fiction and fantasy, and it's quite new. There's only about 4 or 5 collected sets of stories that have been published. Mostly it's amateur work. There isn't anybody who's written for it who you'd think of as like a professional author necessarily, or at least not a particularly well-known one. And the stories came after the world. So solarpunk exists online, really, in places like, you know, Tumblr and so on, where people have been thinking about the aesthetics and the kind of philosophy and the ideals of what it means to sort of be a solarpunk far before anybody wrote a story set in, you know, a solarpunk future necessarily. So these kinds of narratives that are being written now, they're sort of fleshing out these ideas speculatively, but it's more actually a kind of orientation to the present than it is necessarily a kind of utopian vision of the future, although those, as I say, are sort of helping to flesh out what it might mean to be a solar punk, what it might look like, and so on. The way that it conflicts with the present systems, I don't know, it's complicated, frankly. It's very utopian and it has certain problems with it. It's a little perhaps naive. It doesn't necessarily deal very well with what you might think of as transition. So there isn't really stories which are written which take us from here to there, if you see what I mean. It's usually either written in a kind of science fictional mode, where what you have is like a crisis, right, in the past. It's the classic kind of utopian rupture of science fiction, where, you know, if you want to paint a kind of utopian science fictional future, then you have to have this kind of impossible rupture that happens in the past, and then you can just get on with painting your kind of lovely sort of present, as it were. But, you know, we don't know what that crisis is. We, as people alive today, would have to live through that crisis, right, whatever that may be. So it's not particularly good at sort of writing a roadmap through transition. But then again, I don't think that that's really the point of these kinds of stories, right? They're not there to provide blueprints for action necessarily. They're there to provide platforms from which to kind of look back on the present and consider what might be better, what might be worse, and so on. And from that regard, you know, the stuff that's been mentioned already is really, really fascinating for me, because that's the kind of thing that solar punk would allow us to kind of think about as you know, something that's desirable and plausible and so on, which is to say, it's not about the institution of solar power. And this speaks to the, like, you know, where there's a capitalist will, there's a capitalist way, right? Like, it's not about solar power. It's about the social structures in which solar power is developed, through which solar power is propagated in the world, right? Like massive CSP plants in the Sahara Desert providing power to Europe, you know, the extension of the colonial program and so on via solar power isn't a utopian future that we're all, you know, particularly interested in. Whereas models which have to be, you know, have to be kind of elaborated in the sort of slow and dirty work of legislation and so on, which provide for community ownership of solar, which provide for different social relations, which are sort of instituted into the kind of solar infrastructures of the future. That is, you know, the more interesting element of solar, right? It's not the panels, it's the people, if you like. And solar punk, for all its flaws, you know, it paints these kind of utopian small community futures, and I have problems with them, but that is essentially its kind of, its plus point, I suppose, its strength, is precisely pointing out that energy transition isn't enough. It's social transition that's the kind of key factor.
And economic.
I do have a question about slow and dirty transition to follow up with that. Just thinking about for-profit systems again, and decisions about how to generate and transmit energy, who they're made by. You know, these are the people that Nora and Anthony described to us when they did their workshop. It's wealthy executives that are worried about a return on their investment. And we don't have to guess anymore how that impacts customers. The Paradise Fire in 2018 was started by a malfunction in a transmission tower that was over 100 years old. And now we're seeing in Texas how we're learning more each day about how the private energy grid are reluctant to invest in aging infrastructure, combined with the resistance to acknowledge the changing climate, are really hurting and killing people. On top of this, they're charging the exorbitant rates that we're seeing in the news. So what's preventing us from a publicly owned electric company in Philadelphia or Texas or elsewhere? And does that go far enough? And maybe.
Can I speak on that for a second? So it used to be that PECO was the Philadelphia Electric Company, right? I mean, it was like it was a sort of public entity, and then it became it's sort of like this weird public-private thing now, where it's a private company that has to answer to shareholders, but it's also very heavily regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. So it's kind of in this weird space. And then we privatized generation. And this one was super weird. Like, okay, your generation got broken out of your bill, and now you can sort of buy power from lots of different companies out there. And I think the idea behind that was this sort of free market. Oh, this markets will solve all, right? I mean, we're going to have a free market for energy, and it's going to drive down prices, right? That was the idea. And in some respects, I mean, I suppose it's true. Prices have come down in energy, but I would say that it's in not related at all to the deregulation of energy or these private companies. In fact, the opposite has happened. And this is something that I have a very, I think, unique view into, because we do solar on a lot of low-income communities. And that means we get to see the actual bills of people. And what's really happening out there is a travesty. I saw on the, the message board, or the chat rather, that, talking about price caps for energy in the community solar bill. Well, we need price caps, period, because I've looked at some of these people's bills, and they signed up with an energy supplier who promised them a great rate. It was great for 6 months, maybe a year, but then the rate goes up. And nobody really looks at their bill too closely. And so a lot of the people I deal with are paying as much as 5 times more than they should be for brown power. It's not like they're buying green power or anything else, or they're paying some sort of premium, but for brown power. So in a lot of low-income communities, people are really feasting. And this is true too for solar. There are solar companies that are going out and they're feasting on low-income communities that don't have access to information. Maybe they aren't getting competing solar quotes, all that sort of stuff. And they're just paying exorbitantly high rates for their power, when really they should be paying less than the rest of us. So it's a real problem. And I think that we need to deal with this. We need to go to the PUC and to the folks in charge and say, listen, this isn't acceptable. This isn't what we wanted when we ask for a free market transition, and maybe it's time to think about going back or changing this model around a bit.
Any other thoughts on?
Yeah, I would say I live in I like to be practical. I also like to be idealistic at the same time. I mean, I fundamentally believe that at the end of the day, that energy is a public good and should be a common. It's common, right? We live in a society where energy is critical to survival for a lot of folks. And so I'm like, we should not have privatized energy. Energy shouldn't be a commodity. I know we're not there though, as a society and an economy, quite to like make that jump. But I do think public control and more public accountability and ownership is a critical pathway forward. And it doesn't always necessarily mean we're going to get to where we need to go. So someone put in the chat a really great example of like CPS. So CPS is a publicly owned electric utility, energy utility in San Antonio. Yet they have, for a very long time, historically and currently, have ignored EJ communities, have continued to put out a ton of energy that is fossil fuel, and they are not really leading a transition away from fossil fuels to renewables. So even though it's publicly controlled, the folks who are on that appointed to that board by the city council and the mayor are all part of the fossil fuel industry. So you have a publicly controlled system, but the decisions and the people really controlling the entity aren't really rooted in community or on frontline spaces. So I think that's like just a caveat to just making the jump to public control without having the right mechanisms in place to ensure for justice. The other thing too, it's really difficult once you're privatized, it's really, really difficult to make entities public. So it would be really difficult to make PICO a public utility without having a massive public campaign. And also, honestly, you'd have to find ways to really prove that PICO is having lots of neglect. We can look at California. You made a great example, Kristen, around like the wildfires. A lot of them have been caused by just neglect by PG&E. And there's been a whole campaign to turn PG&E away from being a private company into being publicly controlled again. And they're still having a hard time, even though they've actually found like negligence on PG&E's side. I think one of the, just the last point of just like thinking about how do we go at this, one of the strategies should be, or we could be looking more at, is anytime that our utilities are getting public taxpayer dollars, how are we actually following that up with actual accountability? And so they're not just a blank check to continue to do what they're doing. Because they do get subsidized in lots of ways. And a lot of times they get subsidized saying, oh, they're building out infrastructure that's necessary, which is true. But they also, there's no real accountability there. And while the Public Utility Commission serves some accountability, it's not the most accessible for most folks. And a lot of the folks on the PUC in Pennsylvania aren't in Southeast PA. So there's like the different nuances around the region of the state itself, which have to be considered. We could go on for hours about this topic, but that's just a couple quick comments.
Massive campaign. So I just wanted to ask now a question. I think that's about technology. I guess everything has a lot of overlap, but I'm thinking about the technology is here, but there's all these forces that have prevented us from implementing it on a mass scale. And just enter 2035, which is this big number that's been thrown around in zero carbon projections, at least here in the United States. So President Biden has placed a target on 2035 as the year to reach zero carbon in the electricity sector, and General Motors is aiming to have 100% electric vehicles by then also. So I was just curious what you all are thinking about. What do you think about setting a target in this way, like that strategy? And also, what other obstacles or observations do you have about this possibility?
I would go ahead.
Oh, no.
Go ahead, Nora, you start off.
I would say, to reiterate what I said earlier, one of the main issues is, yeah, we see technology as advancing society in a lot of different ways and addressing climate change and things like that, and environmental sustainability. But how are communities who face the biggest burden of climate change benefiting from these things? How are we ensuring that these are community-driven policies, that it's not just a top-down approach, forcing people to do certain things that they don't have the capability of? I think about the soda tax, for instance. In concept, maybe it's a great thing, but who's actually bearing that burden of the costs of that tax? And so, to just reiterate again, the importance of protections on communities, and, these technological advances also get pushed onto the ratepayers, get pushed onto the ratepayers. And so again, the most burdened are burdened even further. Yeah.
Reese.
One thing that occurs to me is so in Britain, I guess something similar in the US, the declaration of a climate emergency, right? Like setting the target. Obviously, it's important, and obviously it's backed by the kind of science which says that we need to do X by Y and so on. But there is a sense in which political parties in the British kind of system, and in the US as well, I'm sure, and elsewhere, tend to take targets and use them as sort of states of emergency, right? So like there is then the possibility of pushing through certain things because it's an emergency, because it's a crisis, which means that you don't need as much public deliberation. Certain things, are put to the side. Essentially, democracy is put to the side because, we have to do it, right? It's like, it's war footing, that kind of language. And it's a tricky conversation because, it is an emergency, and yet how do we do it properly? It's very difficult. I don't know the answer to it.
Yeah, it is. I just want to address the ratepayer thing for a moment that Nora brought up, because that is a frequent criticism of solar, is that I think, there are some that see this concept of SRECs or solar renewable energy credits or anything that adds, you know, some money to the bill as a burden on the ratepayer, and it is. But there are many burdens that are already buried into our rates that people really should be very angry about and pulling out, right? I mean, for example, you know, inner city folks tend to be very easy to deliver electricity to. We're grouped very closely together. It's very, you know, you can get whatever 50 houses on a block and with one line, whereas it's very difficult in suburban areas to run longer electricity lines and have multiple pieces of infrastructure, right? But we all pay the same rate for electricity. Okay, so it's sort of an interesting thing that, you know, and I deal with this with utilities all the time, where they're fighting against solar and they're saying, oh, we don't want to socialize costs. That's how they sort of describe it, as the socialization of costs, right? And I'm sitting there scratching my head saying, what are you talking about? You're already socializing everything in here. You've socialized the delivery of electricity to suburban neighborhoods to urban neighborhoods. You've already did it. It's done in your rate structure. And so, you know, I think we need to instead prioritize what we do want in there. And I think part of that is by saying it's not good enough to have a solar carve out, but we want to have a carve out for jobs, saying that, you know, communities are going to get pieces of these jobs, that we're going to make sure that this is a equitable workforce that's doing this, because that's part of the problem, is that when we have these sort of big revolutions, the Industrial Revolution or the solar revolution in the United States, the people who should be benefiting the most get left out. And that is a real issue in the legislation. Instead of just setting a target and saying, okay, we're going to throw a dart and we got to hit, you know, 100% carbon neutrality by 2035, we got to say we're going to hit carbon neutrality, and this is how we're going to get there, by, you know, making sure low-income people get this and this, that, and the other, and looking at rate structures. And, you know, it's almost too simple to say, let's just make this a number out there. We should deal with, you know, environmental justice while we're doing this, social justice while we're doing this, and try to make that as tight-knit a thing as possible.
I just want to add really quickly to that, you know, essentially the idea that it is an opportunity for community development. Having these technological shifts, it's not just about, you know, part of it is shifting the economy and the way we work from an extractive economy, hopefully, to a regenerative economy. But a big part of that is how we also educate people around these things so that they can engage with these concepts and see how they fit in with this change. And so, you know, thinking about it as community development, we can create work pathways the way that Micah has just mentioned. You know, they're, you know, addressing housing inefficiencies and energy inefficiencies while addressing solar and renewable energy and the, you know, tree canopies on the street. These are all different ways that legislation and other, you know, that we need to take into consideration when thinking about what does it mean to use technology to move us forward.
Yeah, just really briefly as well, we've been talking a lot about the importance of justice in terms of, you know, end users, right, of the energy, of ratepayers and so on. But the panels themselves have to come from somewhere, right? Like, one of the key reasons that the panels are so cheap nowadays is because of, you know, China's kind of stepping into the market and really poor labor relations, really poor economic, like environmental standards and so on. There is a sense in which solar promises us this kind of, you know, liberation, and it's true at this level, but then it has to come from somewhere, and it also has to go somewhere as well, right? Like, the panels have what, 25, 30 years kind of lifespans, and there's no real plan to deal with the like huge amount of like very difficult to reclaim waste that's coming on stream in what, 20 years or so from now. And that's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So, you know, before and after, upstream and downstream, there's questions of justice there. Solar is great, but again, it's about the process, right? Which everyone has already been talking about, but just the process before and after, as well as, you know, the point of distribution.
Yeah, actually, was thinking about something that Arash Kouarzad, I think Arash is here and is also joining us next week as a practitioner, but he was on the panel in 2019 and he had made the point that so much of the infrastructure like highways and dams made possible by like the New Deal created environmental problems and warned us like to not repeat these mistakes that might destroy communities. It also makes me think about this myth that solar is invisible energy that magically arrives from the sun. And so I'm thinking about like the perceptual, like the cultural imagination. And so because that ignores that extractivist component that you're all bringing up. And so, yeah, traveling miles and miles, cutting through neighborhoods, it sounds a lot like our current system. So, I mean, I'm even thinking about how designs are implanted in now in glass windows and roof tiles to further camouflage it. And so I'm curious, maybe Roman and Christina want to chime in. I'm thinking what like does the impact that the impression that solar power is invisible have on our cultural imagination?
Technical, yeah. Can you repeat? We just had an interruption.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could maybe comment on this idea that solar is invisible, what impact that has on the cultural imagination. What are the consequences of it being perceived as invisible and kind of ignoring its extractivist kind of roots?
We just wonder why you think it's invisible. And actually that's what we were thinking about the last 20 minutes. You know, we're not talking about the design and what's beneath the solar panels and what happens under the land or on the land under the panels. So I didn't get the invisible part.
Just that I think it's possible that some people that are less familiar with the technology might think of the power coming from the sun, meaning it's like devoid of actual material, you know, history.
Also, that's how it's sold, right? Importantly, that's how it's advertised. That's how it's kind of promulgated.
We didn't get it.
Sorry. It's maybe a confusing question.
No. And the invisibility, I mean, it's you have light when the sun is out and it's visible and you have the heat or the warmth, you can feel it. And it's energy, as Carter says, that nobody can embargo the sun. So it should be a human right, and we have the capability to use it. And as we see, we lost 40 years, but we're back again. So what Kristen, what do you think exactly of maybe the symbolic part of sun power, or?
Right, or even the way that, you know, what we see, like in my daily life, I'm more likely to see solar power in New Jersey where it's less prohibitive than in Philadelphia. The things I see powered are maybe small surveillance units in like a big box store. And I'm wondering like how that symbolize those things being powered, like how it reflects the core values of a community when what we see solar powering. I don't know if I said that was kind of a jumble of words, but.
Maybe that's what we talked about last week again, as well, that it will transform the landscape in the scale we have to build it to really make it feasible for, or now it's 10% and the goal is 2035 to have the 90% also produced from renewables. And I mean, that's an interesting question, how the landscape will look like, or how we want to change it. Will we have areas where people move together to not have the long pipes for soil delivery. And you have the communities, you can walk by foot to make your daily life. And you have then areas, maybe with sand, where you install this huge solar power plants. What is already done or exists already. But it will really have to be welcomed, you know, like a forest, something that is useful and good to make it not, it's maybe a democratic and a social, socially possible, not only politically ordered or by law installed.
I think we have to start to think about mixing uses with solar, like solar agriculture, and also maybe build solar on parks, whatever, in city situations, like the community solar plant in Philadelphia. Maybe it should be a greenhouse with solar panels on it.
Or I think that more that all these concrete huge places where the sun is really a problem in summer times. So you have no shadow, so you could create more convenient areas in the city itself.
Yeah, you know, I've been in discussion with some of these solar energy companies. They lease land, put solar farms on the property, and then they sell energy to the grid. And they've been operating for a few years now, pretty much unchecked. But according to this company I'm talking to, they're starting to get some pushback from rural areas because of the aesthetics and the intrusion of some of these huge, you know, 100 acres, whatnot, solar farms. And it's starting to become an issue because when they first started, they kind of took zoning boards by surprise. They really had nothing in their zoning ordinance to actually control where these places would go, how big they could be and whatnot. But zoning ordinances are now starting to get up to speed, and according to the company I've been talking to, they're getting a lot of pushback. It's getting a lot harder to get some of these places licensed or permitted to construct. So I don't know if that fits in with your discussion or not.
Yeah, I mean, everyone feel free to chime in the chat, or
that's one of the, so you're raising a topic that we see as one of the biggest places for cost saving. So we talked about, like, you know, the cost of materials has gone down, and that's kind of like on the backs of labor, and that's not necessarily a great thing. Particularly, I mean, my goodness, I recently was reading about, you know, a lot of panel manufacturers are located in the area of China where there is forced labor going on, and it's not a good scene. But that said, the materials cost has come down, but our soft cost, which is, you know, permitting and stuff like that, is actually pretty high. And it's not because of the cost of the permit itself, although that could be lower. It's really because every single municipality has different rules. In the state of Pennsylvania, for example, I'm a licensed electrician in the city of Philadelphia, but I'm not licensed in Lower Merion. Well, I am licensed, but there's a different license in Lower Merion and in other places. And I have to go around and get 50 different licenses. And then I have to comply with 50 different codes surrounding solar. And you would think that they're similar. They're not. It's like, some people want certain equipment outside all the time. Other municipalities want it inside. And so we have to spend quite a bit of time making sure that we understand the rules around solar, and that's for permitting. And now we go to zoning. So there are a whole other set of rules. where you can't place panels within 3 feet, or some places don't allow them on the front of the house, or all this. And when it all adds up to this sort of mess of laws and restrictions and all of that stuff. And I'm a good government person. I'm like, you know, regulation, we need to do it. And, but the way that it's being done now is such a mess. It creates, I would say, at least 20% more expense, which is borne by the customer than really needs to be there. And you look at countries like Germany, where solar is allowed by right. And when you put in your application for solar, they literally have to deny it, not accept it. It's the opposite of here, where you have to ask permission. And I think that we need to look at new rubrics like that, where solar is allowed by right and they have to deny you it rather than you asking permission for it. So that's, you know, zoning is a big issue. So is permitting. And so is the utilities who are sort of the gatekeepers of grid solar. You know, PICO is one of the arbiters who gets to say you can or can have solar on your house. If they say we don't have the capacity in this area, you're out of luck, you know, unless you want to do an off-grid system. So these are all issues we should be talking about and figuring out good solutions for.
I'm thinking maybe before we lose everyone to time, that I'll move into ask you to kind of speculate with me a little bit, the fantasy component, although I realize fantasy is a bit of a misnomer because that's maybe not grounded in reality. I just wanted to ask maybe, thinking about this idea of the cultural logic or narrative around solar power, you know, so we talked about a lot of the reasons that solar hasn't had a strong foothold in the cultural imagination, as strong as fossil fuels. And so studies have shown that cultural resistance, or the psychology of energy, is one of the biggest obstacles to implementing solar power on a mass scale. What role do you think storytelling might play in challenging public perception of renewables? And why isn't scientific data enough? And actually, I feel like maybe we can follow that up with Miranda Moat's comment in the chat. I don't know, Reese, if you want to respond about the role of solar storytelling.
So my kind of broad interest, I suppose, is it's interesting, the 3 topics that you picked to structure tonight: community, technology, and fantasy, because I think the things that I'm interested in are exactly sitting in the middle of those 3 things, right? I don't think that they're kind of separable in many ways, right? Because the institution of new technologies and new infrastructures begin, I think, generally with communities of practice creating narratives, right? Narratives of what that infrastructure would look like, what it would do, what it promises is important. Sort of enrolling actors across, you know, the spectrum, from politicians to investors to entrepreneurs to technicians and so on, scientists, enrolling them in that kind of narrative and in that belief before the kind of technology gets instituted in the real world, before the infrastructure gets rolled out. You have to have people to buy into it, right? To want to make it. And those narratives are important because that's where you get all of the stuff that we're interested in surrounding the brute fact of the technology itself. So, you know, solar is solar, right? But like in that narrative of how it's going to be rolled out, in what the society would look like, in what the culture around it should look like, how communities should be structured around it, how it should be structured in order to enable certain kinds of community structures, certain kinds of ways of living. You know, there are so many different options there that the technology itself is sort of neutral before it's embedded in that kind of narrative, or, you know, any range of narratives. And solar in this case is particularly interesting because since the beginning, since the earliest kind of solar technologies in the 19th century, it's been a vehicle for visions of the future, which have had vastly different kind of beginnings and endpoints, right? From colonial imaginations of like, you know, making it easier to colonize Africa and so on, making it easier to dominate the kind of agricultural systems around the Nile, like Frank Schumann, right? One of the earliest solar inventors was hired by the British government to go and build this kind of system of irrigation around the Nile and so on to bring it under greater kind of colonial control. And at the present moment, you know, increasingly so as it becomes cheaper and more viable, solar is this kind of vehicle for any number of different political narratives, all the way from like really brute neoliberal ones. There's a great text called Taming the Sun. It's a book which argues about, you know, the things which are needed to bring solar online from a kind of purely neoliberal kind of perspective, right? Like what mechanisms do we need to kind of make happen in order to bring solar online in time? And it opens with this kind of narrative of this solar utopia. And there's this bit in it that I can never shake where the author describes his solar utopia, and one line in it where he says, you know, it's not just skyscrapers which are covered in solar panels in this brilliant future, but also, you know, the slums around mega cities have these kind of beautiful like solar panels on. And it's like, yeah, it's great that slums have solar panels on them, but why do we have the slums, right? So, you know, there are these kind of very different narratives around solar power. And, you know, all the way over to like solar communism, you know, like solar power is the thing communism has been waiting for. It's the thing that's going to make communism possible, like that kind of thing, and everything in between as well. So that kind of nexus of like communities of practice who want to kind of create a future for themselves, the technologies that make that happen, and then those embedded in these kind of narratives, these fantasies, those narratives and fantasies are what provide the desire and the value and the organizations which give structure and meaning to the technology. And the way that that technology is then rolled out embeds those values and desires in the way that it's rolled out, if that makes sense, right? So every time solar is rolled out in the wrong way, it embeds that wrong narrative. And that's a kind of big part of the problem. I think I've missed maybe the second half of your question, but I've talked for quite a while now.
To add to the role of storytelling, I would say that part of it is, you know, where a lot of this renewable energy talk is counter to the mainstream narrative. And so how do we break down that mainstream narrative through political education, through the arts, through culture, through economics, all of these different ways. So it's really critical to have opportunities for people to tell their stories in relationships. So when Anthony and I do the electric grid workshop, it's an opportunity for people to see all these different parts and how they connect back to themselves. You know, when we, you know, to your point earlier about the invisibility of solar and the invisibility of our electricity in general, it's hidden on purpose. And so a lot of what we're doing right now is making these critical systems more visible, and like trying to find ways to make these systems more accessible to work for all people. Yeah.
I just to add on that piece, I feel like going back to like, you know, oh, solar, when people react to like wind and solar as like, oh, they're so ugly, oh, we don't want to see them, we don't want to contend with that. It really brings up the conversation. Like I live next to a nuclear power plant, so we have these cooling towers in my backyard, and that was just like, it was everyday occurrence. It's just like, that's where I grew up, that's what you saw. But I think when you, to this point of invisibility, it's in the chat too, around like oil's also been very invisibilized, gas has been invisibilized in a lot of ways. Like we're just so used to this. Renewables are like a stark shift that really just challenges a lot of our assumptions and causes us to have to ask questions. And once we ask questions, that means we're asking questions about power. And that's where I think the storytelling is so important, because that's the best way we can start thinking about how do we think about disrupting power. And Reese, you're so right. You could use solar as a neoliberal, like, white supremacists are talking about going green and talking about solar utopias, and it's a deeply extractive and racist and terrible vision, but they're talking about solar. And then you got folks who are talking about it from like, we need to do this to survive. So you know, it can fit any narrative, but what's missing though is like, how do you really couch these stories around stories of justice, equality, and taking on power? And it's also scary. but it's also, I think, how we really get to this transformation. And to the point around solar schools, like what better way to start these conversations than actually putting them to the schools? You know, my daughter goes to C.W. Henry. It's got a huge rooftop. You could put a lot of solar panels on that school. Now, it would have to be argued, you know, connecting it to like abating the lead, mold, asbestos, all those other issues in the school too. But there's a tremendous opportunity. You can do huge learning and talk about respect for the climate and the earth, you know, dealing with our climate, thinking about the true cost of energy, what that means, making it less invisible so you can be in a position to actually make better decisions moving forward. And we just don't do that. So yeah, storytelling is huge and we don't do it enough.
And I just want to make one other comment about that is the narrative around customer versus citizen. And like the fact that, and this was mentioned earlier about energy being a public good, energy is actually a human right, and it's a basis for life or death. And shifting the narrative from seeing ourselves, like recognizing A, that it's an investor-owned utility, but B, that shifting the narrative from customer to citizen can also help in moving and shaping and shifting into these new systems we're talking about.
Go ahead, Christina.
On the other hand, you can also say, it's like Mika said, you have to have a deny button against solar. You could also say what is not powered by the sun. You have the powered sun energy in the grass. The grass is stored in the cows, etc., etc., etc. So.
I guess I meant electricity, I should be clear.
Juan had put a question in the chat and I was just going to ask if he would share it.
Hello, sorry, thanks for answering my questions in the chat, I appreciate that. Just confirm you guys can hear me. Thank you. Yeah, so I was wondering if creating, I don't know, like any sort of nationalized anything that we replace a national identity as sort of like our individual identities, and creating this, the way that participating in government or a society isn't necessarily by choice. There's a lot of forces that kind of coerce a certain level of participation, and one of those forces is energy and access to energy, and access to, you know, forcing your lights and, you know, your refrigerator to stay cold requires a certain level of participation, and, you know, you clock in and out of work, and part of that is you want your lights to stay on. And so having energy sovereignty creates a certain level of autonomy that drastically alters how you participate in civilized society, and that isn't always necessarily compatible with the sort of public good, which there's a lot of subtext within that kind of language. And is there a way of enabling public power, and can sort of a neoliberal government really be fully trusted to put energy fully in the hands of communities? I understand the need for policy to protect communities, but is that ever fully possible within sort of a large national? It's like a very broad question with too many, I can't imagine a cohesive answer, but any sort of wisdom, because I'm assuming you're all experts in your own right, and I'd appreciate any of your perspectives on how public power can create autonomy and what that might mean for communities. Because like Nora said, there are certain disenfranchised communities that they're not part of the conversation. And there's a lot to me, that means a lot for why that might be the case. Okay.
I guess to get the ball rolling, one thing that it makes me think of immediately is communities that want out, right, of what you might think of as the national body politic. So like indigenous sovereignties, like communities in Canada who are precisely trying to get away from the kind of oil and gas state by installing solar panels, and whose land is historically disenfranchised by precisely those oil and gas companies. So I think that points towards the idea that you're right, that there is a sense of conflict there between a kind of national body politic and a kind of energy community, which is separate from that. Traditionally, a nation is the things which connect it, right? Like nations famously arose from, print media, right? National newspapers. Ideas of national consciousness arise from things like the national grid and national rail systems. So if you start to dismantle that, then you are going to get different hierarchies of identity, I suppose, different hierarchies of political identity. I mean, I think one of the kind of key, and I'd like someone else to speak to this if at all possible, I think one of the key problems with ideas of community energy sovereignty is the fact that if you disentangle yourself from the body politic of the state and ideas of public good, you don't disentangle yourself from capital, right? You still have to buy the solar panels, you still have to have those kinds of relationships. So you kind of reground yourself further, perhaps in more problematic relations without any kind of buffer that the state might provide, right? Any kind of idea of the common good that the state is not very good at it necessarily, but that's its kind of idealized role. So it's a really good question. Yeah, like how do you prevent a kind of regrounding in worse relations if you do go for energy sovereignty?
I mean, I gotta say, my experience installing solar has introduced me to a very wide array of individuals out there. And it's pretty crazy the number of people who go for solar. Like, I remember being in this dude's basement because we have to go to the main service panel, and I opened the door and it was like I walked into this gun manufacturing plant. It was unbelievable, man. This guy had guns all over the walls, and I was immediately like, and I'm frightened by guns. And he's like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Dude, there's like a lot of guns down here." And he's like, "Yeah, man, that's why I want solar, man, so I can survive on my own." And I'm like, "Whoa, that's nuts." Hadn't quite considered that. And then here we are like talking about, community energy and how can we make this for the community and lower cost. So I think it sort of points to like the vast array of solar stuff out there. I mean, again, similar to that, I was working in Southern Maryland, and like I heard this thing on, I love to flip through the radio stations, and I was listening, I don't know, to this Christian talk radio station, and the first commercial was, "Get your Patriot solar system. This is the most American thing you can imagine since, sliced bread. You can survive on your own. You don't need anyone." I was like, man, I would never advertise solar like that. But like, apparently somebody is, that appeals to someone. And so it's kind of interesting in that in Pennsylvania, one of the very few places where really hard right Republicans and Democrats agree is actually on community solar. Is they're working together. This guy Dan Laughlin and Art Haywood are about as opposite sides of the spectrum as you can imagine, and they've co-sponsored a bill for community solar. One guy's there saying Trump's the greatest thing ever, and that what happened at the Capitol was nothing, and the other guy's there saying we got to throw this guy out, and he's a wingnut, first class nut job. And here they are, they're both on a solar bill, and so I think it points to that solar has hit a nerve somewhere across a lot of different ideological beliefs that it can work. And I never expected that, but it's an interesting development.
Yeah, I do. I put in the chat just like 2 resources I got the privilege to work on with Emerald Cities Collaborative. We worked with a bunch of community groups around like an energy democracy scorecard. And it starts to interrogate this slightly, and not to the level you asked. It's not quite that far for a tool, but it's a tool for communities that start thinking about how can they start organizing around energy sovereignty and decisions. And what came up in some of those conversations is there is all among the people in that quote unquote you know, the energy democracy movement. So folks are really trying to think about like, how do we have more governance and control and ownership over our energy system? You have folks there who, again, believe it could be a public good, and other folks who believe it's a way to build wealth. And there's a point in time where those do come to a head of like kind of being contradictory, or at least challenging with each other, or tensions with each other. But a huge debate is, to get to energy democracy, is do you take over the grid and make it a national grid and make it all public? Or is it, do you have decentralized community-owned systems? And that's like a real debate that I never thought of that as a debate until being part of this process and conversation. So I just like an interesting thing that I think is real, and we are just, I think, starting to interrogate these questions more in the US context anyway. I feel like it's more common in the global context, which, using the US space, like we don't think about global enough. But you know, it's interesting.
So Jacob put a good question in the chat. Jacob, do you want to ask your question?
Hi. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I'll just basically reiterate what I wrote. Is it more favorable to decentralize solar power to the scale of the homeowner as opposed to centralized producers? Basically what you were just addressing. I mean, I think you kind of started to cover that topic a little bit, but I think this is interesting to me as someone who's just in the last 2 weeks been getting into this solar debate. I'm currently doing my diploma thesis project, architecture project, and I'm tackling this issue about kind of what a alternative solar community, central entity, or decentralized distributor of solar energy could look like in this particular context in France in 2021. So, I mean, this is kind of interesting to me because now in positioning this argument on what exactly the program of this project is intended to be and what the model of the future is going to be, especially if kind of being subsidized by governments or promoted by governments, whether or not, you know, like people are going to act in a centralized kind of magnet framework, or rather a decentralized notion. I also recently, maybe some of you are familiar with this. This was just my introduction. I watched this Third Industrial Revolution by Jeremy Rifkin, and he was talking about how maybe the new centralization in power is one of more of a managerial aspect, where now centralized powers might make more profit off actually producing less but managing more. And so that to me seems to assume that it's going to be decentralized in nature in terms of the actual power structure, but maybe in the managerial sense, it's a bit more centralized. I don't know, just maybe. That's my question or thoughts. Yeah.
I have a question for Micah, I think, probably for Micah, that I feel like might be related to Jacob's question. To your point earlier about, you know, the Republican and the Democrat coming together over this community solar bill, and how like a lot of right people want to get community solar to be on their own, like to be independent, right, autonomous. But the way that the bill is written still says that you have to put your electricity to the grid. So you're still connected to the grid, the greater grid. I read that correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
I think they're looking at community solar as a way of, it's sort of a free market thing for them. This is another market choice, so to speak. And also, you know, the idea that that rural landowners can have lease residual payments, you know, appeals to a lot of the folks in the middle of the state who have a lot of rural landowners who are looking to, you know, maintain or keep their farms, that sort of thing. I think that's what appeals to them, but to be honest, I don't really know. I mean, these guys, they have the strangest logic in the world. And I'm like, well, you know, if it works for you, I guess. But to also answer a little bit of Jacob's question, my personal philosophy with solar is we should try to use the already used spaces as much as possible. So we should develop solar in very urban areas. We should cover the rooftops of buildings. use every square inch of used space, and then go out and start trying to do more open space development stuff, or do it sort of slowly while we're using the already used spaces. Yes, there are lots of open spaces like, you know, brownfields or landfills or stuff that probably aren't going to see much development. And sure, you can put solar there. But I want to be very clear that when I'm talking about solar on farms and stuff, I'm not talking about putting solar over cropland or, you know, removing farmable land so that we can produce energy. I don't think that that's a smart move. And I think that it's not either or. Do we want distributed energy or centralized energy? It's both. And we got to have both, because, you know, you get resiliency with distributed energy. You know, you can have small battery-backed systems and all of that, and they're not subject to, you know, wires being knocked out by a storm or something like that, like we saw in Texas. Whereas we also need large solar fields, because if we want to accomplish our climate goals and get down to, you know, zero carbon electric production, we're going to need more than just our roof spaces. So hopefully that answers.
Okay. But, Jacob, if there, you said either there is like a national grid, or there is the owner who has the solar panels on his own roof. But maybe there should be national regulations for zero carbon houses, or like that the goal should be use less and have more than for others, for other energy devices or so on.
I have maybe one last question before we say goodbye, and it's specifically about Philadelphia, but I think that it can be applied anywhere really. In Philadelphia, we have a really contentious tax abatement that allows for like really aggressive and rapid development. The construction sites are really kind of limited. They're not, it doesn't seem like, without knowing too much, just witnessing them, they're not thinking about the future. I've actually even seen these buildings blow over in the wind. They don't seem like, they like just hold a limited view of what they make possible, what worlds they make possible. And I'm just curious how we could disrupt patterns like this and demand moving forward that all new development projects are seen as an opportunity to improve infrastructure and implement carbon-free systems, amongst other demands that we can make.
I think part of it is having the conversation with labor groups and really connecting why these issues, like supporting the transition if necessary, but like, you know, really bringing in labor and workers into this movement to, because they're the ones who are doing this work. And of course, more people in addition. I would say the other aspect is legislation. You know, there's legislation can be passed that requires new buildings to, you know, there are different requirements that exist. And so why aren't we putting, you know, that as legislated?
Yeah, I mean, man, labor groups, I mean, that's a tough one too, because, you know, we want high standards and we want to have safety. The worst thing that can happen is a fire caused by solar, right? I mean, we had one of those on a Dietz and Watson plant here, and it just set us back in the industry, because all of a sudden the whole narrative was, well, solar causes fires on buildings. And it's like, oh man, now we got to deal with that too. And like, so yes, having high quality and making sure that it's done in a safe way is hugely, hugely important. There is an organization out there called NABCEP, the North American Board of Certified Energy Practitioners. They issue a certification for solar installers. And I think sort of requiring some sort of certification is really good. But at the same time, I want to be very careful about that, because that can also be a barrier to entry for low-income business owners who want to get into the field. And so sort of balancing having that quality thing with also making sure that everybody can get the certification needed. It's not like an expensive certification to get is really important.
Yeah, the other thing I'll just add is, I think there's two things. One, in Philly in particular, you know, we have councilmatic prerogative, and so city council folks who have their districts they really do set the agenda for what gets developed. And I think we need to be putting more pressure on our elected officials on, you know, having better standards on what they approve and don't approve around land use development and housing. But I think for us to really do this is going to require just like significant, massive public investment. And President Biden has this vision of wanting to invest in climate infrastructure, and he signed on to this Justice 40 plan, which 40% of all energy and climate funding would go to frontline Black and Brown communities. Like, we need to be ready to figure out how do we like access that resource and that capital coming in to be able to do electrification for homes in the city, to think about like any new development. If you want access to this funding, you have to make sure you're doing like passive housing or whatever standard we think makes the most sense. And those questions are we're not organized enough yet, I think, for that to happen. I think there's elements in pushing, like the work that Nora's doing with power and trying to organize communities around that is getting us there, but there's still a lot of work for us to move. And I love solar states, and we need 15 more solar states. Like, Mike is great, and I'm not trying to get Mike out of business. We just need more. Like, we need more people to be able to develop and drive and move this work. And so we just need more investment in small businesses and folks who are trying to figure this out.
I think on that note, I'm gonna have to break in. Absolutely, and understanding how to unlock and uncover that money to raise more money and to get it into the hands, particularly of Black and Brown communities. Nothing seems more urgent at this time, so that is the perfect note to end on. I would really love to thank all of our panelists today, all of you who also posed such excellent questions in the chat. Special thanks, especially to Kristen and Ricky, for curating this marvelous conversation. Really important, really timely, really excellent set of interlocutors. It was such a pleasure to get to know all of your work a bit more. I've dropped in the chat more links. If you haven't yet had a chance to click through to see the additional and supplemental materials that Ricky and Kristen have curated sort of behind these programs, please check them out. They're a really fantastic resource. And we will really look forward to seeing everyone, I hope, in 1 week's time, again here, Thursday afternoon, 4 p.m. Eastern time. We're just really excited about this the final bookend in this trilogy, creative proposals, concrete proposals, speculative proposals for the Solar Imaginary, beginning to sort of think through a concrete idea of what this imaginary might actually look like. Thanks again to all of you, and we look forward to seeing you at future PPEH programs. Good night.